The taper period is the deliberate adjustment of these 4 training elements prior to a race. And if you know what adjustments to make, you can expect a 3% improvement in your running performance. That's the same benefit that Nike promises if you wear one of their super shoes. However, if you get the taper wrong or completely ignore the taper, then your months of training can all be for nothing. You see, marathon training is a lot like baking a cake. You need the right ingredients, you need a step-by-step recipe, and then you need time and patience. But preparing for a marathon without a taper is like taking the cake straight out of the oven, slapping on some icing, and assuming it's ready for eating. If you really want the best race day performance or the tastiest cake possible, you need a cool-off period and to implement the final touches. Otherwise, your target goals can quickly crumble. Get it? Crumble? Luckily, we have some really good research that clearly outlines how you can adjust these 4 elements and effectively go from bake to cake.
And by that, I mean the 3% running improvement thing, not like actually eating the cake.
And because you Run Smarter scholars deserve more than just what the research shows, I'll tag on an extra 5th element at the very end. Let's start with the taper duration, which is the element that refers to the length of the taper. For instance, some runners can choose to taper for 1 week, 2 weeks, or sometimes even 3 weeks. But what does the research say? Well, this meta-analysis compiled 27 previously published papers, and conveniently they constructed this graph, which shows 1, 3, and 4 week tapers do show some improvement in performance, but 2-week tapers seem to yield the best results. The authors suggest that a 2-week taper seems to represent the borderline between the positive influences of fatigue disappearance and the negative influence of detraining. So we now have step 1 from bake to cake. But there are still 3 more elements to consider, plus my extra bonus at the end. And by the way, I'm making this video because of you Run Smarter scholars. You've asked in previous comments in previous videos about the taper, so I've included to create this, including Bev, who needs this video before her race in June. So if you ask in other comments, I'll try my best to deliver. So keep those comments coming, and Bev, best of luck for your ultra race. Okay, let's cover element number 2, which is the taper volume. Training volume can be calculated as the number of miles per week, or it can be calculated as the number of minutes for your workouts. Personally, I like to use minutes because we can then factor in cross-training sessions, such as like a 60-minute spin class that can all get added in. Now, I know a few of you are going to start to squirm at the idea of reducing your training volume. And it is common and completely normal to think that you might lose fitness if you pull back and do less. After all, you don't want to sacrifice all of the gain and hard work that you've put in just because some crazy Australian told you to run less. But let's look at the research. This paper looked at the muscle changes with a taper and said that muscular strength and power production is usually suppressed by chronic intensive training, but most likely recover during the taper when the training load is markedly reduced. Essentially, you will get stronger and fitter, the opposite of what runners fear when they're told to taper. Think of it this way, an adaptation cycle works when you challenge your body with physical activity and stimulate it enough to trigger the adaptation response. But the body doesn't get stronger during the workout phase. Instead, it requires the necessary recovery to adapt. No downtime, and the body doesn't get stronger. Now expand this example from one workout across an entire training cycle. Usually, you will approach your peak weeks and your peak training volume towards the end of this training cycle, just before the taper, and then the relative downtime. This downtime can then work its magic and help you reap the benefits of adaptation. Not only is muscle strength improved, But this paper reports that there is an improvement in your running economy, increased circulating testosterone, and an increase in your maximal oxygen uptake during the taper. In other words, due to the effects of the taper, your body is physically more geared for performance. Okay, Brody, I'm on board with what you're saying. And I'm sorry I called you a crazy Australian before. But how much of a reduction do I need for optimal performance? Good question. Again, we can draw our attention to the first paper I mentioned, which depicts a volume reduction between 41 and 60% for maximal performance gains. Personally, since we now know that the taper will take about 2 weeks, I like to reduce the volume of week 1 by 40% and then the second week by 60%. This will hover your overall reduction close to 50%, and that fits right within these guidelines. But there are 2 main ways you can reduce volume. First is by doing less on each run day, and the second is keeping the same duration for your sessions, but just halving the number of sessions per week. With that said, let's talk about the third element, which is our training frequency. Your training frequency refers to the number of training sessions administered per week. Surprisingly, the research tends to recommend maintaining a similar frequency as you were doing before the taper. They suggest that even if you take a conservative approach, you should still maintain 80% of your training frequency. Practically speaking, keeping the same number of running days, with, if you want to take the conservative approach, removing one of those days. Whether you should remove one of these running days or not, I think should be based on your psychological readiness for the race itself. You see, the taper isn't just about physically preparing your body for top performance, but it's also to enhance your psychological state. So, I have a task for you. Self-reflect and ask yourself, how do I feel during the peak of my training? Do I dread the looming long weekend runs? Is it taking me longer to get out of bed? Am I finding more excuses to back off the intensity? These fatigue and motivation alarm bells could indicate that you need less running during the taper period. And therefore I'd choose that 80% frequency option. And psychologically speaking, the research will suggest that the correct taper can also improve your mood state, improve your perceived effort, and improve your sleep quality. Essentially restoring that excitement and energy that you had in the first place when you first signed up. The fourth element is your training intensity, which refers to the overall effort in your workouts, rather than just the duration. And what the research suggests actually surprised me. Take this paper for example, which took 9 middle distance cross-country runners and took them through an 8-week training block. Then they needed to complete one of these taper designs, essentially splitting it into a complete rest taper, a low intensity taper, and a high intensity taper. After completion, each runner would wait about 4 weeks before repeating another training block and then a different taper method until all athletes had trialed all the taper approaches. This is the graph looking at a time to fatigue test after each taper phase. And as you can see, the group that maintained a high intensity improved their fatigue test by 22%, as opposed to the low intensity group, which showed an improvement of 6%. Granted, this study has a very small sample size, but the earlier meta-analysis also agrees with this finding. It seems counterintuitive, but maintaining speed during your taper while reducing the overall volume is a perfect approach to maintain the physiological adaptations while preventing a decline in performance. The way I see it, your cardiovascular fitness can be really easily preserved with these short, fast sessions, but take these speed sessions away, it seems like your neuromuscular adaptations needed for a strong, fit, fluent stride will quickly dissipate. So if you already have speed sessions throughout the week, keep them in and lower the volume around it. If you haven't done any speed sessions, don't add them in. This will increase the likelihood of injury because you haven't yet adapted to those intensities. Now, before I get to my bonus element, I want to mention that every runner will come into a taper with different fitness levels, different mileage, different muscle fiber makeup, different genetic variations, and recovery strategies. This means that everyone will respond differently to a taper. So my advice is use these 4 adjustments as like a foundation template, because most of you will get the optimal benefit. But once you know how you respond, you can choose to make micro adjustments when preparing for your next race and seeing if it yields greater results. After all, how do you know what's the best possible cake you can make if you don't experiment with the final touches? Okay, time for my 5th element. Only because you Run Smarter scholars have already watched this video and know exactly how to strength train to improve your running by 4%. By the way, you're going to be smashing these records in no time. Let's have a look. A 4% increase with strength training plus a 3% increase with a perfect taper. These are really starting to add up. But here comes my 5th element. What do you do with your strength sessions during the taper? Well, if you're already doing heavy stuff, here is my summary. 2 strength sessions per week will help build strength, and 1 strength session per week will help preserve strength. So before the taper, maybe somewhere in the peak weeks, you can reduce those strength sessions to once a week. Listen to your body to see when the time is right. Then continue once a week in the first week of your taper. Next, you can remove that strength session in the second week, or if you choose to keep it in, maybe lift at about 80% weight than you did pre-taper. This will help achieve the best performance. But wait, now you have the taper dialed in, the next important step to help guarantee your best performance is to learn the best pacing strategy on race day. So check out this video and good luck with your race. If anyone knows how to grease and line a cake tray, comment below. No, I'm just joking. I hope this doesn't rise too much. Look at me, doing dishes while she's living her best life.